Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk about development, and this is going to be a really big overview of a bunch of different concepts. So there's a lot in these video notes, but essentially what we're going to do is do a little overview of modernization, wealth, and quality of life, and how they're related. First, I want to talk about the demographic transition theory. This is historically the road to modernization, and as far as models go, it's very accurate historically, but there are some questions about will it continue to be accurate. But basically what we're talking about is the relationship between industrialization and population growth, and the idea that these things go hand in hand. So all societies start out in stage one, where you have a high crude birth rate, that's what CBR is, and a high death rate, that's what CDR is, but they're nearly the same. And crude birth rate, by the way, and crude death rate are both the number of people born or die, depending on which one you're talking about, per 1,000 people. So if you have a CBR of 30 for every, that's really high, by the way. If you have 1,000 for every 1,000 people, you'll have 30 babies. Okay, so that's a crude birth rate. Now, this is the hunting-gathering lifestyle. You're at the subject of the environment, and this is most of our history, but there is no one in stage one today, right? And it's the agricultural revolution that changed that. So what happens is you move into stage two, and what's happening in stage two is that the crude death rate falls while the birth rate remains high. And this is because mortality is changing, right? More babies survive, more people survive, and the agricultural revolution is connected to that because it gave people a steady supply of food and allowed population to grow by preventing so much mortality. This is the stage in which population growth will be the highest. This is the stage where countries are in danger of exploding beyond their capabilities. And so it's really important to get through stage two quickly. And stage three, the crude birth rate also drops. The death rate's still dropping, but not as rapidly. And so your population is still going to grow, but not as rapid. And we will talk about what causes birth rates to start dropping. But a big one is the idea that because you see that babies are surviving, that you don't have to have as many babies to have the number of children that you want. And there's some other things that go with it, but that's one of the big reasons that birth rates are going to drop. And again, we'll come back to that. It's a little bit hard to read stage four there, but in stage four, your birth rate and your death rate are once again equal, but they're low. Unlike in stage one, where you had lots of babies because lots of babies die, here you can have fewer babies because more babies survive. And ideally, you are in zero population growth at this point. So basically, zero population growth in stage one, rapid population growth in stage two, slow growth in stage three, and zero population growth in stage four. Now, of late, we've noticed that there is a stage five. What is stage five? Is this where births, again, pop up and greatly outnumber deaths? The death rate is higher than the birth rate reaches zero, the death rate reaches zero, or colonization of other planets happens because we're overpopulated. Well, we're not colonizing other planets just yet. In this case, this is where the death rate actually is higher than the birth rate. The birth rate falls below the death rate because people are not having as many babies. It's not an official stage, but here you have negative population growth and a declining population. And this is a really good table to look at. It's very important that you understand what's happening because a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are going to relate to demographic transition theory. Okay, but basically you've got high birth rates in 1 and 2 because you need little hands, right? And there's a high high infant mortality, right? Then you get improved medical care, you get good nutrition, you get good sanitation, fewer children are needed because there's opportunities for jobs, all sorts of things, and those things are falling. And then by the time you get into stage 4 and 5, you are an industrialized nation. You've got family planning, good health, improving status of women, all sorts of things. It is great, right? Okay. Which of the following is not that should say a weakness, not weaknesses, silly me, which the following is not a weakness of demographic transition theory, that developing nations can leapfrog the technology of developed nations. It doesn't take into account other factors like economic stability, conflict, status of women, and literacy. Developed nations don't help developing nations, or modern technologies may allow countries to bypass stages. Well, developed nations do help developing nations all the time. So C is the correct answer to this question. A, B, and D are weaknesses of this theory. Okay, so we're at a point now where we're not sure that the old path of demographic transition will look like the new path because so many countries have already done it. They may be able to help other countries do it differently in the future. All right, so let's talk about this from a social perspective. What is the impact of development? We're going to tie this into cities. First, I want to talk about the psychology of cities. And there are two going thoughts. There's the modern theoretical view that cities don't interfere with interpersonal relationship, that even in cities, kinship and ethnicity will bind people together, and that a city is really just a patchwork quilt of urban villages that are really supportive in helping people deal with the pressures of urban living, because urban living is something that is different for us historically, right? Living crowded in cities like ants is not something that we're really used to in terms of our evolutionary path. Okay, so there are some ideas that cities don't really do that, and that urban living actually isolates people and detaches people from interpersonal relationships, and with the addition of social media, that is even more intense, and that your primary social bonds will weaken in favor of these superficial social bonds with people you just happen to see every day, you work with, whatever. And so what ends up happening is that you see people becoming more lonely, becoming more depressed, and more stressed. And frankly, most of the research shows that this is actually the case in cities. Yes, you do have all of these opportunities, but underlying these little social networks that you see all over cities, they are very surface, they're very superficial. And so it's an interesting time for us to think about that. Now, one of the reasons that we can live in cities is because we have economic systems. So we're going to switch gears a little bit because you can't talk about development without talking about economic systems. So I just want to briefly go over the basics. You've done this if you've taken economics, obviously, but you've also done a little bit in your history classes, but I just want to review that real quick right here. And first, I want to ask you a question. What does an economic system do? Determine who receives money, determines the type of currencies, determines how to use limited resources, or establishes laws to control the flow of goods. Ultimately, an economic system determines how you're going to use limited resources, because every country has limited resources and those have to be dealt with, right? And that's what economic systems do. So economics itself is the study of how those goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. And you can divide it into two categories: microeconomics, which is really individual agents; macroeconomics, which is the whole big deal, okay? Which of the following is not a question that should be answered when determining an economic system? What goods and services will be produced? What regulations should govern them? Who will consume the goods? And how will the goods and services be produced? What regulations govern trade are not part of determining an economic system. It's what are you doing? Who's going to do it, and how are you going to do it? Those are the three big questions in an economic system. Now, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be regulations, and that there are regulations, but that's a governmental thing. So let's talk really quickly about the types of economies. You have the traditional economy. This is your barter and trade. It's really rare today, right? Mostly it's among rural groups, tribal groups, and in some cases, some really small antiquated cultures, like within the Amish community, they will actually trade. But with the English world, they will use money, right? So it's not even their traditional economy fully. Then we move into the market economy. This is capitalism or free enterprise, and there's all kinds of different types of capitalism that we're not going to talk about. This is just the idea of the free market, that it is individuals and groups that generally profit, and make the decisions. Supply and demand determine the price. The government does not. And then, interestingly enough, most market economies are actually a mixed economy, which I'll talk about in the United States. And they do have some economic planning. It's not like laissez-faire, right? It's just, there's regulations, there's stuff, but it's mostly free market. All right, so which is a fundamental characteristic of a free market economy? Prices are determined by the forces of supply and demand. Traditional methods of production are used. Government economic plans are followed to meet market demand, or consumer market tastes are shaped by product advertising. Supply and demand is the fundamental characteristic. Now, consumer market tastes can be shaped by product advertising. That's why people advertise, but that's not the fundamental characteristic of a free market economy. That's just like something that happens because you have competition. Buy my stuff, it's better, right? That's because you want people to demand your stuff, so it's about supply and demand. So what about a planned or command economy? These are your socialist and communist economies. This is where all decisions are made by, or most decisions are made by the government, and this is the fundamental difference between the two. Who makes the decisions? Planned and command, planned or command, that is the government. Free market, that is individuals, entrepreneurs, anybody. If you want to set up a lemonade stand, you go outside, you set up a lemonade stand. Now, you might have to get a permit because there's the mixed economy kind of idea, but you probably don't have to pay the government a percentage, and the government isn't running your lemonade stand, which would be happening in a planned or command economy. So, socialism, the government runs some of the industries, most of them. Generally, they're state-provided services. Interestingly enough, they typically are mediocre at best, right? Because there's no competition, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. We have a lot of bureaucracy in the United States, but there's more in a socialist country. In communism, and people use these words interchangeably. Some people argue that they are, but these are kind of the sort of textbook definitions. In a communist government, not communist government, communist economy, economy and governments are different, right? You don't have a communist government, you have a communist economy. You don't have a capitalist government, you have a capitalist economy. Okay. In communism, the government runs all of the industries, owns all of the property, sets all of the wages and prices, and provides all of the services. There's nothing private at all, right? Nobody rents anything from the state. The government does it themselves. And the renting from the state, that's actually something that happens in China. They also have a mixed economy. It's more communist than it is free market, but they have a little bit of capitalism in there. All right, and this is designed to create the classless, moneyless, stateless population. There has been no record of any long-term success. In terms of making a highly productive country. I'm not saying that there aren't communist countries, but when you have a straight up, strictly communist country, it doesn't really work out very well. North Korea is a really good example of that. And here are just some comparisons between communism as it's acted out in a country and capitalism as it's acted out in a country. All right, most capitalists would criticize the economic system in communist countries because it overemphasizes the production of consumer goods, it requires too much dependence on foreign imports, it pays wages that are too high for the quality of workmanship, or provides little incentive to improve methods of production. I really like this cover of this book. This is actually a cover of a book, and you've got all these cute little breads, and then you have the one loaf of bread. And the idea is that if the government owns everything and there's no competition, why would you try and be better? And so capitalists would suggest that there's no incentive to improve, and so everything just stays and stagnates. Whereas if you are in a competitive environment, a free market environment, then people are constantly trying to get better so they can be better than the competition. And so the consumer benefits by having better and better goods and services. Okay, and then just here is communism versus capitalism again. Who's right? You decide. Now, most of these are mixed economies. They range from mostly capitalist with some socialist components like public schools or postal services, police, fire departments, city services, like us. Or they're capitalist with large amounts of social services like the EU. Or they're mostly communist, like China, which we already talked about. All right. Now, when you put politics and economics together, this is typically how it goes. Not always, but typically. Authoritarian states, usually communist or socialist, right? Not all authoritarian states are communist. Again, China, right? Is well, okay, that's a little questionable, but because businesses are renting from the government and they are an authoritarian state because they are a one-party state. But there are some who would like to have dictatorships but also like to have a capitalist economy. It's not as common, but it happens. And then there are, of course, just warlords, right? That's an authoritarian state and they don't really have an economy in particular, right? So there you go. Most democracies are mixed economy. Many are more capitalist. Sometimes they're more socialist. It just depends. And it depends on who people vote for, too. You can have countries swing back and forth between more capitalist and more socialist depending on what party's in charge. All right, so what are some indicators? I told you we were doing this fast. What are some indicators of economic development? Well, there are four big things we look at: growth, development, the Human Development Index, and then, like this kind of catch-all category, other things. So, what is growth versus development? Growth is the measure of the value of the outputs of goods and services in a country within a period of time, or a city, or wherever, right? Development is the measure of welfare of the people in that society. Okay, so when we talk about growth, we're talking about money stuff: the national income, the gross domestic product, the real GDP versus the nominal GDP, which we will not talk about in here, the gross national product, and then all that per capita, right? Per capita growth, stuff like that. Here are just what those terms mean. Gross domestic product is everything that's produced within a country, and then gross national product is the value of that output, right? Which was the gross domestic product, plus the property income from abroad, right? And so that takes into account all of the money flow that you have, right? GDP per capita, right, is about how much that is per person. So that's going to take into account the size of the population. If you have a GDP of a certain number, but you've got 5 times as many people as a country that has the same GDP, you do not have as much growth, right? Okay, now there's some problems with using this, and it's one, a lot of this is self-reported by countries, or it's kind of cobbled together, and so we don't really know how accurate it is. And then two, it doesn't really talk about the distribution of income, right? Do you have really, really wealthy people and really, really, really poor people, but no middle class? Or is everybody in the middle class, right? And so you don't really see how it's distributed. You might have a situation like we have in Dallas. These houses are like on the same street, actually, and here you have a house that's $500,000, and here you have very low rent apartments. And so the GDP does not show you, or GNP does not show you this kind of situation. And that's why we want to move to development. Okay, and here's just the median household income of the United States. We have a really high GDP, and we have a lot of growth, but it's not distributed equally. And so this is where the quality of life question comes in. Changes in economic growth don't really measure changes in quality of life overall. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind is, does having more wealth actually increase quality of life, or does it cause additional stress? Increased health and family problems, which would decrease quality of life. So there are all these questions, and that's where development comes in. Okay. Development is sort of a normative concept, and this is talking about human welfare. So we're going to talk about things like poverty when we talk about development, inequality, progress. We also want to think about, what does progress mean, right? I don't know. So barriers to development include all of the following except social conditions, biologic diversity, foreign debt, disease, or political corruption. Well, social conditions, that's like it, quality of life, right? Foreign debt, that's going to talk about how economic growth is happening, and that's going to translate to what wealth looks like for individuals within the country. Disease is going to talk about healthcare, standards of living, and then political corruption is going to talk about how well people can actually be, or how successful people can be in a country, right? All right, so development, could include all kinds of other things, right? Like political freedoms. How free are you? Can you say what you want to say within reason? Can you do what you want to do within reason, right? Sustenance. How well are you eating? What are your choices? Sustainable development. Self-esteem is something that we could look at. Also, what about the proportion of activity in different sectors of the economy? Do you have a good wide range of job opportunities, or is it really narrow, right? Those are all good questions for development, and they also play into something called the Human Development Index. And countries can be assigned a number on the Human Development Index, and we're going to look at this further, the HDI, in class, right? The Human Development Index is a socioeconomic measure, so it really ties in growth and development together in a lot of ways, and it focuses on three dimensions. Longevity, which is how long you're going to live, which really talks about quality of life, access to healthcare, sanitation, diet. Knowledge, this is literacy rates, access to education, access to higher education, and then standards of living, right? This is the GDP per capita and how much disposable income people have. How much are they able to consume? All right, and then other measures, you could come up with a million different things: crime levels, stress levels, disease indicators, all kinds of stuff to talk about economic development and indicators, gender equality, any of those things. So the question becomes, how do we really measure development? Is it dependent on who's looking at it? Is it, what definition do we use? What are the things that really indicate development? This is a tough question, and there are arguments about it all the time, right? Is it the number of TVs, the number of cars, how much stress you have, crime levels, right? Job opportunities, access to healthcare. That's a lot of doctors, right? Okay, here is your next question. Is your last question in the video notes. Pollution, desertification, and tourism are all environmental issues, right, that happen in countries. How might we frame those in terms of development? Beneficial byproducts of development, byproducts of maquiladora development, costs of development, unsustainable development, or that they are beneficial. Maquiladoras are factories, and we'll talk about those later on. The AP curriculum really focuses heavily on maquiladoras. So again, we'll talk about those a little bit later on. But ultimately, these environmental costs, many people consider those the costs of development. And one other thing that I just want you to keep in mind as we talk about society and economy, that there is an environmental component, and it is important to balance all three of those things, not just society and economy. All right, and then trade versus aid is a conversation we've had a lot, and so I put this table in there just talking about the argument for trade and the argument for aid, and then you get to decide where you think that balance is. All right. That was a lot of information. We're going to work with it more in class, just a lot of basics right there. And if you have any questions, please ask me at the beginning of class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.